Although it was clear that the Germans were preparing an attack, the Crimean front, thanks to Meklis, did not abandon their own attack deployment. Instead of creating the deep defensive layout required by the open terrain of the Kirch Peninsula, all but 2 of the Soviet divisions were deployed within 2 or 3 miles of the front line. To make matters worse, the Russians were convinced that the Germans would concentrate their attack against the northern part of the line, where they had attacked in March. The 47th and 51st Army were packed into this salient that bulged invitingly into the German area. The 44th Army was left to cover the southern part of the Parpak Isthmus. But Manstein could see no point in attacking either the western face or southern flank of the Russian salient. He was not interested in simply pushing the Russians back towards Kirch, where they might escape back across the straits. He wanted to cut off and destroy the whole enemy force. This would not be easy, given that his forces were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. Manstein sought every advantage he could find to compensate for his numerical weakness. A detailed deception plan was organized. 42nd German Corps and 7th Romanian Corps made very obvious preparations for an attack in the north, including simulating troop movements, building dummy artillery positions, sending false radio traffic, and carrying out very obvious reconnaissance of the Soviet line. On the other hand, no major troop movements were allowed into the 30th Corps area in the south until the night before the attack. When Manstein visited Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg on the 16th of April, he insisted that the strongest possible air support would be required. As a result, 8th Air Corps under Baron von Richthofen was assigned to support Bustard Hunt. 8th Air Corps was the Luftwaffe Specialist Ground Support Force and was reinforced to a strength of 460 aircraft for the battle. It was ordered not just to attack frontline positions, but to check the movement of Russian reserves or any attempt to pull back. The plan for the ground attack was that 30th Corps should lead the way with 3 infantry divisions. They were to break through the Russian defences and secure a route for the 22nd Panzer Division and a supporting infantry division. Their specific task was to enable 22nd Panzer Division to cross an anti-tank ditch at the back of the Soviet defences. To help in this task, an infantry battalion was loaded into assault boats to outflank the ditch by sea, though the boats were really designed for use on rivers. Once it was clear of the ditch, the Panzer Division was to drive northeast and cut off the retreat of the 2 northern armies. The 42nd and the 7th Romanian Corps would help to destroy the encircled force, while a special mobile group under Colonel Grodek would lead 2 of 30th Corps divisions in a dash to prevent Soviet reserves or retreating forward units occupying prepared lines in depth. Manstein insisted that the attack should be prepared by the 1st of May, but that it would not be launched until the weather was suitable. Fine weather was essential to dry the ground for the tanks and allow the Luftwaffe to bring its full weight to bear. Operation Bustard Hunt finally began on the 8th of May and ran almost exactly to plan. Almost every Soviet division was engaged on the first day of the operation, leaving almost no reserves. In any case, the Soviet command system was so disrupted by air attacks that the front command soon lost control of the forces. Rain during the night of the 9th and 10th of May threatened to delay the committal of the 22nd Panzer Division, but when the weather cleared and the ground dried, it became clear that the Russians were not trying to withdraw. They were still trying to hold their positions in the north and restore the line in the south by counterattacks. The 22nd Panzer Division fought some fierce tank actions, but could not be stopped from reaching the northern coast early on the 11th of May. While 42nd Corps, under General Mattenclot, coordinated the destruction of the encircled Russian divisions, Freta Pico's 30 Corps drove on towards Kirch. 42nd Corps had wiped out the northern pocket by the 13th of May. The next day, von Grodek's mobile group reached the coast, though he was mortally wounded on the way. By the 15th, Kirsch was in German hands, and 3 Soviet armies had been annihilated in a week. 11th Army had captured 170,000 Soviet troops and over 1,100 guns and 250 tanks, at a total cost of just over 7,500 casualties. Operation Bustard Hunt was a miniature example of blitzkrieg tactics, planned and executed by one of the greatest masters of the art. However, Manstein still had unfinished business at Sevastopol. That would be a very different sort of battle. At the time of the German siege, Sevastopol was said to be the most strongly fortified place on Earth, and that its defences could only be breached by a massive concentration of the heaviest artillery. 208 artillery batteries were brought into position on a 22-mile front around the city. Most of these guns were conventional field artillery, but they included a unique array of specialist heavy weapons. 12 11-inch coastal artillery howitzers were the smallest of these guns, and there were another dozen 14-inch howitzers. Guns of this size had been widely used in the First World War, and all the major armies still had a number of such weapons in their armories. But the Germans had also developed some super-heavy guns that had no equivalents elsewhere. Gamma and Karl were mortars, but far removed from weapons used by the infantry. The 6 Gamma mortars had a caliber of 42 centimeters, and the 3 Karl mortars were 60 centimeter weapons. Although both types had huge tracked carriages that allowed them to move short distances under their own power, longer moves required the use of special road trailers or rail wagons. Dwarfing even these monsters was Dora, the largest gun ever used in action. In 1918, the Germans had bombarded Paris with the famous Big Bertha. The bombardment was not very effective, but the German army had been mortified that such a prestigious weapon had been developed and operated by the Navy. Between the wars, the army had been determined to develop its own supergun, and this had been achieved at the Krupp's works, where it was known as Gustav, after the head of the Krupp's family. The gunners who crewed the monster preferred their own nickname, Dora. The 80-centimeter caliber gun fired 2 types of shell. A 4-ton shell could be fired nearly 30 miles, and a 7-ton concrete-busting round had a 23-mile range. The whole system weighed about 1,350 tons and took over a month to assemble. The firing detachment consisted of 500 men, but altogether 1,420 men, under a major general, worked to support and protect the weapon. From Soviet accounts, it seems that some of the most effective guns used by the Germans during the siege were anti-aircraft weapons. Because 8th Air Corps had air supremacy in the Crimea, its commander, General von Richthofen, was able to allocate an anti-aircraft division to work with the ground troops. Its 20mm, 37mm and 88mm guns were very mobile and could be brought into positions where they could destroy fortifications by direct fire. They were especially effective against the smaller earth and wood bunkers that the Russians had built all through the Sevastopol defences. These were very difficult to locate and destroy with conventional artillery, but could hold up an infantry attack for a long time. The high-velocity shells of the anti-aircraft guns could knock these bunkers out with 1 or 2 shells and allow the attack to continue.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The decision to complete the conquest of the Crimea had been taken in the spring of 1942. It would have been possible to leave Sevastopol with a smaller screening force and use the bulk of 11th Army to cross the Kerch Straits and assist Army Group South's drive to the Caucasus. But Hitler had a fixation with the capture of famous cities, and Manstein argued that it would be operationally unsound to leave the Red Army a bridgehead in the rear of Army Group South. So preparations were made for an assault on Sevastopol, starting as soon as possible after the close of Bustard Hunt. The new plan was called Operation Blue. The defenders had not been idle during the 5-month pause in the siege. Although they'd lost much of the first defence line and the most northerly part of the main defences between the Kacha and Belbek rivers, most of the fortified gun positions were still in Soviet hands. These were supplemented by new field fortifications dug into the caves and crevices of the rugged hills around the port. New minefields were laid, using over 100,000 mines of all types. Reinforcements and supplies had been brought across the Black Sea, and the garrison now consisted of 7 rifle divisions and a number of naval infantry and other independent brigades that were almost at full strength. Their total strength was 106,625 men. They knew an attack was imminent and were determined to hold Sevastopol at all costs. Signs began to appear on the fortifications that read, "Come on, fascist dogs, we are waiting." As in December, Manstein was obliged to make his main attack in the north. The one winding road along the coast was not suitable for heavy traffic, nor did the ground allow long-range observation of artillery fire. However, it was vital to prevent the Russians from massing too large a force in the northern sector. 30th Corps were allocated 3 divisions and about a third of the artillery for a supporting attack. Their objective was the Sapun Heights, a naturally strong ridge that had been used by the British and French armies in the Crimean War to protect their besieging force from Russian attempts to relieve Sevastopol. The battles of Inkerman and Balaclava had been fought in front of the Sapun Heights, and the British war cemetery on the ridge became part of the Soviet fortifications. North of 30th Corps, the Romanian Mountain Corps was responsible for a holding operation on the unfriendly ground of the Yala foothills. The main effort was to be made by 54th Corps, with 4 divisions and a reinforced regiment, supported by about 2/3 of the available artillery, including almost all the super-heavy guns. 42nd Corps, with 1 German division and some Romanian units, was left in the Kerch Peninsula, in case the Russians tried to repeat December's amphibious landings. Manstein was under great pressure from Hitler and the Army High Command to complete his preparations and to capture Sevastopol as quickly as possible. He knew that if there was any delay that threatened Operation Blue, the assault might be called off and 11th Army would be left in a strategic backwater. The air and artillery bombardment began on the 2nd of June. While the Luftwaffe attacked the city and harbour to disrupt Soviet communications, the artillery concentrated on counter-battery work. The permanent fortifications were easily identified and provided the first targets for the heavy guns that achieved some success. On the 6th of June, Dora fired 7 rounds at Fort Molotov and another 8 at an ammunition dump known as White Cliffs. Smoke and flames were seen coming from both positions. One shell had in fact penetrated 90 feet of rock to destroy the ammunition dump. On the same day, Karl knocked out one of the gun turrets on Maxim Gorky 1 with a direct hit. It was equally important to locate and neutralize the Soviet field artillery in their camouflaged positions. At first, these guns did not respond, but once they revealed themselves, they were subjected to a steady bombardment. The infantry assault began on the 7th of June, but there was no quick breakthrough. It was a grim struggle, reminiscent of the Battle of Verdun in the First World War. The Russians fought to the last man in their pillboxes and larger fortifications. If they lost ground, they tried to win it back by immediate counterattacks. After 10 days, some of Manstein's regiments were so exhausted that they numbered only a few hundred men. One company consisted of an officer and 8 men, and the average strength was barely 25. Manstein exchanged the weakest regiments with new units from the Kirch Peninsula so that the divisions could stay in line. The 17th of June proved to be a turning point. Both German corps suddenly changed their axes of attack. 54th Corps, having finally captured Fort Stalin and won a foothold on the Mackenzie Heights, turned west, and 6 more forts fell that day, including the famous Maxim Gorky 1. The same day, 30th Corps managed to seize a position known as the Eagle's Perch in front of the Sapun Heights. The Corps concentrated on broadening this penetration to form a start line for an attack on the heights themselves. 54th Corps spent the next few days clearing the northern shore of Severnaya Bay. German artillery now dominated the harbour, and supplies could only be brought in at great risk. The submarine M32 was nearly lost while delivering petrol supplies. As it lay on the harbour bottom to avoid daylight air attacks, leaking petrol fumes almost knocked out the entire crew. One chief petty officer remained conscious, and he managed to bring the submarine to the surface. The Russians were still defending their positions ruthlessly, but they no longer seemed to have the reserves or the ammunition for counterattacks. Once again, the critical moment was approaching, and again it was Manstein who sensed the changing balance and found the means to tip it in 11th Army's favour. Although the Germans had broken through the main belt of defences, the rear position was untouched. It was based on the steep Sapun Heights and ran from Inkerman in the north to Windmill Hill and Fort Maxim Gorky II on the south coast. There seemed no alternative to a frontal attack by 30th Corps, but the roads in that sector were not good enough to move the heavy artillery and ammunition that would be required. It is a mark of Manstein's desperation at this point that when the fall of Tobruk in North Africa was reported, he asked Army Group South if the commander of the British garrison could be sent to the Crimea. Manstein thought that he might be dropped into Sevastopol by parachute, and that this proof of German success in siege warfare would create a strong demoralizing effect on the Soviet defenders. Not surprisingly, nothing more was heard of this plan, and shortly afterwards Manstein produced the idea that was the key to final victory. On one of the daily visits to forward units, he went to an artillery observation post in the 54th Corps area that had an excellent view over Severnaya Bay. The bay was the main fleet anchorage and up to 1,000 yards wide. The southern shore was well defended, with tiers of strong points dug into the cliffs. But Manstein began to wonder if it would be possible to launch an attack across Severnaya Bay and then take the Sapuan Heights defences from the flank. 54th Corps' staff were not enthusiastic. How could they even get assault boats down to the shore, let alone across the bay, in the face of such defences? Manstein's response was simple. If the Russians considered an attack across Severnaya Bay to be impossible, they would not expect the Germans to even attempt it. For that reason alone, the Germans had to attempt it. Everything would depend on achieving surprise for the crossing that was set for the night of the 28th and 29th of June. There was to be no artillery preparation, but every available gun stood by to bombard the southern cliffs if the alarm was raised as 100 assault boats crossed the bay. The leading regiments were ashore before the Soviet defenders realized what was happening, and as dawn broke, 30th Corps joined in by threatening a wide frontal attack on the heights, but then launching a concentrated attack by 170th Division along the main road to Sevastopol. With massed airstrikes and the direct fire of an anti-aircraft regiment, the division reached the crest and then broadened its penetration so that other divisions could move up in support. 28th Light Division captured the strong point at the British cemetery on the ridge, as 170th Division pressed on until it reached the Chersonese Peninsula at the western tip of the Crimea. The Russians were forced back to the Crimean War fortifications, and on the 30th of June, the famous Fort Malakoff was captured. By now, the defenders were short of ammunition and other supplies, and suffering a day-long aerial bombardment from 8th Air Corps. Admiral Oktyabrsky received Stavka's permission to evacuate Sevastopol that night. Several hundred high-priority personnel were carried off by air, and about 3,000 managed to escape in light craft of the Black Sea's fleet. On the 1st of July, resistance collapsed, although some positions held on for a few more days. Maxim Gorky too was the last fort to be captured. And even then, some of the defenders refused to surrender and were buried alive when German engineers exploded demolition charges. The 11th Army had finally conquered the Crimea. Hitler was delighted with the victory, which seemed a good omen for the start of the 1942 campaign. Manstein was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal, and a special Crimea Shield was awarded to all the personnel of 11th Army. On the Soviet side, a medal for the defense of Sevastopol was instituted, and after the war, Sevastopol was named as one of the hero cities of the Soviet Union. It was right that both sides recognized the individual valor of their ordinary soldiers, who overcame appalling conditions and fought beyond the limits of endurance. At this stage of the war, the tactical skills of the German soldier could still compensate for the numerical superiority of the Russians, but the Crimea campaign showed they were equal in courage. However, although the Red Army had some very able and determined commanders, Manstein had that touch of military genius that proved decisive and swung the balance in the Crimea. Unfortunately for Germany, he was not allowed to remain in southern Russia. Hitler decided that Manstein's genius lay in capturing trophy cities, and he ordered that his new field marshal and the greater part of his 11th Army should be transferred to the other end of the Eastern Front and conquer Leningrad. Even though one of the original objectives of the Crimean campaign had been to put at least a strong force over the Kerch Straits to help capture the Caucasus, the striking power of Manstein's army was dispersed over the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Caucasus continued. But as Hitler's attention became centered on Stalingrad, the campaign faltered. The Russians kept control of the oil fields and most of the Black Sea coast. After the fall of Stalingrad, the Germans were forced to retreat, but managed to hang on to the Kuban bridgehead, including the Taman Peninsula, and so deny the Red Army a route back to the Crimea. In 1943, the strategic focus lay in central Russia, where the Battle of Kursk proved that the balance was definitely turning against Germany. Army Group A under Field Marshal von Kleist held on to the Gottenkopf position in the Kuban throughout the summer of 1943, but the Soviet advances in the Ukraine after Kursk left it hopelessly isolated. Hitler gave permission to evacuate the Kuban on the 3rd of September, and most of von Kleist's men were hurried through the Crimea only just in time before the Red Army's advance across the southern Ukraine reached the Black Sea coast between the Crimea and the river Dnieper. The Crimea was cut off, and the German and Russian armies once again faced each other across the Sivash. In November, the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla carried troops of the North Caucasus Front across the Kerch Straits. At first, they could only cling on to two small beachheads at Kirch and Eltigen, but at the end of the year, new landings at Feodosia on the north shore put most of the Kerch Peninsula back in Soviet hands. As the winter operations came to an end, the Crimea was still occupied by a German and Romanian force under the 17th Army, commanded by General Erwin Jeinecke. One opportunity to evacuate the peninsula had already been lost in late October 1943. Jeinecke and the commander of Army Group South Ukraine, Field Marshal von Kleist, had both called for the peninsula to be abandoned once the Kuban evacuation was complete. They were told that Hitler would not allow the word Crimea to be mentioned in his presence. Marshal Antonescu also wanted to get his troops out of the Crimea, but Hitler insisted that it must be held. His justification was that the Crimea could be used as a base for air attacks on the Romanian oil fields, or for amphibious landings on the Black Sea coast of Romania and Bulgaria. Von Kleist therefore told Jeinecke to defend the Crimea. At first, Jeinecke refused, saying he would not be responsible for another Stalingrad. After a bitter telephone argument, he gave in. Although the generals continued to press for a sea evacuation during early 1944, Hitler refused to accept that there was no strategic justification for holding the Crimea. In fact, he insisted on reinforcing the 17th Army, which grew from 1 division to 5. With a mass of logistic units, Russian volunteer troops and labourers, Luftwaffe and naval personnel, there were nearly 250,000 men in the Crimea, although only a small proportion could be described as combat troops. The Russians were in no hurry to begin an attack. Their propaganda mocked the Crimea as their biggest and safest prisoner of war camp, where the Germans fed and guarded themselves, and if they left on leave, came back of their own accord. But the Soviet General Staff were preparing a series of offensives that would sweep up and down the Eastern Front throughout 1944. The opening move would be in the north, to free Leningrad from its 3-year-long siege. Then the Red Army would strike in the south to complete the liberation of the Crimea. The battles would be fought over the same ground as Manstein's campaign of 1941 and 1942, but both armies were very different organizations. The German army was no longer riding on a wave of 2 years of unbroken success. Although it could still win small victories, the big battles eluded them. Manstein had fought with divisions that were often under strength, but reinforcements had always arrived. By 1944, the German manpower pool was becoming exhausted, and divisions, regiments, battalions often existed only in name. The German soldier would still fight with skill and courage, but increasingly from desperation rather than belief in his inevitable victory. The Russian soldier knew that the German army could be beaten and was determined to take revenge for the damage done to his homeland. Although the Red Army did not have limitless manpower resources, its units were maintained at combat-effective levels, and soldiers and junior leaders were no longer badly trained. The greatest change in quality, though, was among the generals. It was the German High Command who were now most affected by the dictatorial whims of an incompetent political leader and his cronies. Most of the great leaders of the early years had lost Hitler's trust. Manstein himself was sacked by Hitler at the end of March 1944. Stalin, on the other hand, had settled into a reasonable working relationship with his general staff. His generals understood each other well and had developed an operational formula that made the best use of the Red Army's strengths and disguised its weaknesses. The coming offensive in the Crimea, like the other strategic offensives of 1944, would demonstrate that the Red Army was no clumsy steamroller winning by sheer numbers, but a flexible and sophisticated military machine, mastering the classic military virtues of surprise, concentration, maneuver, and speed. The generals directing the operation were typical of the new breed of Russian field commanders. The group of officers who planned and commanded the Crimean operation provide a typical cross-section of the Soviet High Command in the final stages of the war. The oldest was Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, who had been a comrade of Stalin during the Russian Civil War, particularly during the fighting at Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad. When Stalin came to power, he appointed his old comrade Commissar for War in 1925, a position he held until 1940. The war with Finland and the first year of the war with Germany highlighted Voroshilov's incompetence, and Stalin used him as a scapegoat for early defeats. However, he escaped the purges that destroyed better commanders and was given a series of high-sounding but unimportant appointments. In sending Voroshilov as Stavka representative with the Independent Coastal Army, Stalin was rehabilitating his loyal supporter, but he took good care to send General Stemenko, the very competent head of the operations department, to make sure that nothing went wrong. Voroshilov represented the old guard of politically reliable but militarily incompetent commanders who had plagued the Red Army at the start of the war. The new breed was typified by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, who was sent to oversee the 4th Ukrainian Front. He was not yet 50, but had been identified as one of the brightest brains of the young Red Army between the wars, and was promoted quickly within the General Staff until he became its head in June 1942. However, he spent less than half his time in Moscow. Once the basic work of planning an operation had been completed, Vasilevsky was usually sent out as a Stavka representative. These men were the links between Stalin and the generals commanding the armies and fronts or groups of armies in the field. Vasilevsky took a leading role in all the Red Army's great victories, such as Stalingrad and Kursk, the 1944 offensives, and the war against Japan in Manchuria in 1945. He was a quiet and calm man who might have been a priest or a teacher, but for the Bolshevik Revolution. His professional ability was unquestioned, and he was never seen simply as Stalin's messenger by the front commanders whose operations he supervised, including General Tolbukin. Fyodor Tolbukin had been a front chief of staff during the First Crimean campaign, which left his career under a cloud. However, he redeemed himself by his performance as an army commander at the time of Stalingrad, and as a front commander throughout 1943. He was a meticulous planner, and before the attack on the Crimea, spoke to every regimental commander to make sure that he understood exactly what his troops were required to do. By 1944, every Soviet front seemed to have a reliable commander such as Tolbukin, capable of planning and executing complex operations to a strict schedule. One potent weapon the Soviets had was numbers. At the start of the operation, the German defenders of the Crimea numbered just over 200,000 men, whereas the Russians had 470,000 waiting to strike. They were backed by nearly 6,000 guns and mortars, compared to 3,600 German weapons. The Russians also had 560 tanks and self-propelled guns, opposing 215 German armoured fighting vehicles. The greatest Soviet advantage was in the air, where the Luftwaffe had less than 300 planes to face 1,250 Russian aircraft. But the Germans were holding strong defensive positions on the narrow isthmuses at Kirch and Perekop, and a quick victory was not guaranteed. The Germans had faced and beaten such odds before. The Russians could attack the Crimea from two directions, from Kirch or from Perekop and the Sivash. Stavka decided to use both axes. The main attack would be launched in the north by Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front, with a supporting attack by the Independent Coastal Army at Kirch starting 2 or 3 days later. To oppose them, the German 17th Army had 5 German and 7 Romanian divisions. 3 German infantry divisions under 49th Mountain Corps and a Romanian cavalry division and 2 infantry divisions forming the 3rd Romanian Cavalry Corps were deployed in the north. The 5th Corps held the Kirch Peninsula with 2 German infantry divisions, a Romanian mountain division and a Romanian cavalry division. Coastal defence and anti-partisan security was in the hands of a mixture of Romanian units. Deep defences had been built at both Perekop and Kirch. The Germans knew that they had to hold the Russians in those sectors where the ground was narrowest, preventing the Russians from deploying their full strength. Once these defences were breached, the Germans would be unable to repel the Soviet armoured forces in the wide open spaces of the central Crimea, and would have to fall back to Sevastopol. Defence lines had been constructed around the city, but the Germans had neither the time nor the resources to rebuild the shattered Soviet fortifications. However, they could hope to hold the Russians long enough to organise an evacuation across the Black Sea. The main blow had to come in the north, where it was possible to assemble and supply an overwhelming force of artillery, armour and other troops to support the assaulting infantry. The obvious, if only, axis of attack was over the Perekop Isthmus, which had been used in Manstein's attack. The German defenders were concentrated in this sector. However, in their drive across the Ukraine at the end of 1943, the Russians had managed to seize some small bridgeheads on the southern shore of the Sivash Sea. They were too small to use as assembly areas for a major force, but Soviet engineers began to build causeways and footbridges back across the Sivash. They were built at night, often using German prisoners as labourers, and were hidden from air reconnaissance because they lay just below the surface of the water. Second Guards Army would pin down the main German force by attacking at Perekop, but the main blow would be delivered by 51st Army across the Sivash. For 5 days before the attack, heavy artillery pounded strongpoints in the German line. The assault began on the 8th of April with a 2.5-hour bombardment by every available gun, mortar and rocket launcher. Second Guards Army led the way, and after 2 days' struggle managed to pass the first line of defences at Perekop, but were held at the next line in the Ishun Defile. But while German attention was fixed on Perekop, 51st Army was winning the battle further east. Using the underwater roads and various boats and pontoons, wading through the freezing water where necessary, the Soviet troops shook the 10th Romanian Division, whose resistance collapsed on the 9th of April. By the next day, the Soviet front line was clear of the narrow defiles between the lakes, and 19th Tank Corps was moving forward. General Jeinecke gave the order to retreat to the Gneisenau stop line in front of Simferopol. On the 9th of April, the Coastal Army had begun its attack at Kirch. Under steady pressure, the Germans were forced to withdraw to their rearward lines across the narrowest part of the peninsula at Akmonai. But when the Russians began their breakout in the north, there was no point in delaying any longer. 5th Corps began its retreat to Sevastopol. Those units falling back along the winding coast road were able to keep stopping and checking the pursuing Russians. But those who moved over the more open ground north of the Yala Mountains had a more difficult task. Like their comrades retreating from Perekop, they were harried by mobile groups formed by every Soviet formation. Manstein had improvised similar detachments in the mobile stages of his operations, but in 1944 the Russian groups were far better equipped and much more powerful. They were trained to bypass points of resistance and press on into the enemy rear, seizing crossing points and communication centres, and reaching reserve defences before they could be occupied by the Germans. The German and Romanian forces had to keep moving, or they were cut off and surrounded. Units got back to Sevastopol, but they'd been shredded by the relentless pressure. Equipment had to be abandoned, and the men who escaped death or capture arrived at Sevastopol with no more than a personal weapon and a rucksack. During its 150-mile march from Kirch, the 73rd Infantry Division lost nearly 4/5 of its men. Perhaps there were as many as 120,000 men in Sevastopol on the 16th of April, but 17th Army considered that its real combat strength was no more than 25,000 German soldiers in the 5 Kampfgruppen, or battle groups, which were all that were left of their 5 divisions. The troops in the Kampfgruppen were ready to fight on, but they also assumed that they would be evacuated in the end. But as often before, military logic made no impression on Hitler. He chose to believe the most optimistic reports about the strength of the Sevastopol defences and the ability of Navy and Air Force to support the besieged force. He argued that it was necessary to hold the city in order to keep Turkey neutral for another couple of months, long enough to beat off the expected Anglo-American landings in France. He refused to allow an evacuation and sacked General Jeinecke because of his continued protests. About 65,000 men were left in Sevastopol at the beginning of May, facing 3 Soviet armies with 27 divisions and over 450,000 men. The German plan for the defence of Sevastopol assumed that the Russians would have to make their main attack in the north, as Manstein had done, because the road and rail network was so much better there. So most of their infantry and mobile artillery were concentrated north of Severnaya Bay, to deny the Russians the Mackenzie Heights. However, once again, Tolbukin thought he could make a major attack over ground the Germans considered unsuitable. He began with a feint attack in the north, where 2nd Guards Army attacked the Mackenzie Heights early on the 5th of May. But 51st Army and the Independent Coastal Army were to strike the decisive blow against the Sapun Heights east of Sevastopol. Under cover of darkness, the assaulting force was assembled for an H-hour on the 7th of May. The attack began with a 90-minute artillery bombardment, with 200 guns firing on each kilometre of the attack front. But the key to success was concentrated air power. After 2 days backing 2nd Guards Army, 8th Air Army switched 1,000 aircraft to support the new attack. By the middle of the morning, the red flag was flying on the Sapun Heights, and the fate of Sevastopol was sealed. With defeat staring the Germans in the face, Hitler finally authorized an evacuation late on the 8th of May. It was far too late. A final position had been prepared on the Chersonas Peninsula, and as 19th Tank Corps was released from Balaclava, the Germans abandoned Sevastopol in a rush to reach this last refuge. And on the first night, the 9th of 10th of May, 15,000 men were taken off the peninsula. However, once daylight came, the Soviet Air Force struck at the convoys. Only a small number of men were rescued during the next night. A convoy of a dozen ships got to within 25 or 30 kilometers of the shore during the 11th of May, but at least 4 of them were sunk by air attack while they waited for landing craft to ferry troops to them. Conditions on shore were equally grim. The last days were spent under constant air and artillery bombardment. The wounded and the non-combatant troops were crammed into the passageways of the ruined Soviet coastal forts, while the remaining fighting troops clung to their trenches on the bare Chersonas plateau. Drivers, cooks and clerks took up arms and joined the front line. At least 20,000 men were left on the Chersonas. Resistance was hopeless, and they began to surrender, marching off into captivity in long columns for the benefit of Soviet newsreel cameras. Some preferred to risk the sea and set out in any boat or makeshift raft they could find. Most were drowned, but during the night of the 12th and 13th of May, the first motorboat flotilla made one last sweep and picked up 83 men, the last remnant of 17th Army.